Welcome back to the History and Sociology of Rock Music. We're going to be going into Module 3, and this is our third lecture this semester. We're going to look at 1950s country western, rockabilly, and early rock music during this module. So please make sure you have your notes handy and you're ready to take notes. At any time during this video, you can pause and finish out your notes, and always make sure when we're getting to the music that you pause and you take a second to click the links below, either in the description box on YouTube or below the video on Blackboard, and watch those videos and listen to the music. Traditional rural music in America evolved primarily from the folk music brought to America by British immigrants. The Appalachian region of Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky were particularly important to the survival of the music tradition. By the early 20th century, city dwellers began to mockingly call the poor white inhabitants of this region hillbillies, and the simple folk music they played, hillbilly music. The British folk tradition included ballads, which typically tell a story, lyric songs, which are often songs of love, and then we also have work songs. Unlike African work songs, British work songs often came in the form of sea chanties, railroad songs, and lumber songs. At first, folk music in America was simply sung verbatim by the new colonists as it had been in England. But over time, songs often underwent just subtle changes as their original meaning and purposes were forgotten, and singers started to adapt them to their new environments. New songs in the same tradition were also written. A good example of a traditional English ballad that survived in America is Barbary Allen, a timeless song about young lovers and death believed to be from the 17th century. Evolving over the years, we now have at least 216 different versions. It is still a folk standard that has been performed by artists like Joan Baez, the Everly Brothers, and even Bob Dylan. So please take a minute, pause right here, and listen to a little bit of Barbary Allen. Traditional rural music was first recorded in 1923 with fiddlin' John Carson at a local radio station. The record sold well throughout the region, surprising record company officials. So sensing an opportunity, Ralph Peer of Victor Records went on a talent hunt to other rural musicians in 1927. He set up recording equipment in a warehouse in Bristol, Tennessee. He offered $50 a song to anyone who would audition. Both the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers came, who would become the first commercially successful and important performers of country music, as it was starting to be labeled by the late 1920s. Now, the Carter family is led by A.P. Carter and his wife Sarah and their sister-in-law Maybelle. They learned hundreds of traditional songs and performed them, putting emphasis on their strong vocals and a revolutionary flat-picking guitar style that is still commonly used by folk guitarists. Now remember, this Carter family is probably a little bit familiar to you if you've ever seen the movie Walk the Line. So June Carter is from the Carter family, and she is also, or was married to Johnny Cash. So you probably have, if you've seen that movie at least, you've heard of the Carter family. Jimmie Rodgers is known as the father of country music, the Mississippi Blue yodeler, and the singing brakeman. He was a railroad worker until his poor health forced him to quit and concentrate on music. Between 1927 and 1933, when he died from tuberculosis, Rodgers recorded over 100 songs. He sold millions of records, and he became the first nationally known country star. His song topics and vocal style, which included blues inflections and a signature yodeling, set the mold for later years. So at this point, please pause the video, click the links either in the description box below or underneath the video on Blackboard, and listen to these songs by both the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers. Radio played an important role in popularizing country music. In 1923, the first barn dance program was broadcast featuring live performances by country artists. Other shows soon followed, including the program The Grand Ole Opry, which became the most widely heard and influential radio show of its kind. Because the Opry was a live broadcast, performers had to maintain a presence in Nashville at least one day a week. and many moved there permanently. Songwriters, publishers, recording studios, and all the major record labels soon followed, and by the early 50s, Nashville became the capital of the country music industry. Around the same time, the radio was starting to make country music more accessible. Hollywood filmmakers were starting to popularize cowboy songs and westerns, and so stars such as Gene Autry, who is known as the Singing Cowboy, and Roy Rogers rose to fame. Cowboy songs were dressed up and orchestrated to give them a smoother and more commercial sound. The singing cowboys themselves were also dressed up in hats, boots, and ties to elevate them from the older and undesirable hillbilly image. Pause right here and take a second to listen to Back in the Saddle again. Cowboy songs helped pave the way for other commercialized offshoots of country to emerge that would reinvent the genre. One of these was Western swing, which became popular during the swing era, and whose biggest star was Texas fiddler Bob Wills. Wills' band and the Texas Playboys combined traditional country instruments with those found in swing big bands, so like trumpets, saxophones, and drums. Wills had his biggest hit in 1940 with New San Antonio Rose, which went to number 11 on the charts. Take a second here and listen to Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys perform San Antonio Rose. One thing to take note of, Bob Wills actually really admired Bessie Smith, the blues singer, and you'll notice that he tries to use inflections that are more bluesy and things like that. So as you listen to him, try to listen and hear and see if you can hear the blues element to his singing. Another stylistic development was bluegrass, which was invented and named by mandolin player Bill Monroe and his band, the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe developed a unique genre that relied on faster tempos and jazz-like virtuoso solos that were spread evenly among the mandolin, the fiddle, and the guitar. When guitarist and vocalist Lester Flatt and banjo wizard Earl Scruggs joined the band in 1944, the Bluegrass Boys were in their prime. Now the cool thing about bluegrass is this is a type of music that we listen to or that is well known around here in Kentucky, and because we are known as the bluegrass state. And even if you're not a huge fan of country music, just watching bluegrass performers is often amazing because it's so fast and you have to be really, really good at the instrument to be able to play bluegrass music. And so if you ever get a chance to watch some bluegrass music, even if you don't love the sound of it or the genre, just watching them perform is just absolutely amazing. Take a second here, pause, listen to Bluegrass Boys by Uncle Pen, start within 30 seconds in there, and enjoy some bluegrass music. Honky-tonk grew out of the bars and roadhouses of Texas and the South, where the patrons were rough and rowdy and hard drinkers. The music is characterized by songs of drinking and cheating, loves that are gained and lost. And to be heard above the din of the crowded saloons, the honky-tonkers developed a louder, driving sound by adding drums, electric guitar, and electric pedal steel guitar that modernized country music and inched it closer in sound to the first rock and roll style, which is known as Rockabilly, and we'll talk about that here a little later. Although his recording career only lasted 6 years, the man that most personified honky-tonk was Hank Williams. And he's also known as the Hillbilly Shakespeare. Williams was a master poet with a knack for catchy melodies who wrote some of the most enduring tunes in country music history, including Hey Good Lookin'. His drinking problem paralleled that of his rising fame, and his life began to fall apart. He died of alcohol intoxication in the back seat of a car on his way to a gig on January 1st, 1953. Take a second, pause, and check out this video, Hey Good Lookin', and I believe with this link, unless it goes down and I have to put a new one in, that June Carter actually introduces him so that you can get a reference on who June Carter was. DJs around the country began programming R&B around the 1950s. So R&B records were put in jukeboxes, giving teens more access. White bands responded to the demand by including a few R&B type songs into their repertoire. A country group called the Settlemen, led by guitarist and vocalist Bill Haley, covered a Jackie Brenston song called Rocket 88, giving it a more country feel. By 52, their popularity was growing, so they scrapped their cowboy image and adopted a wilder R&B styled stage act and changed their name to Bill Haley and his Comets. Although somewhat successful, it wasn't until they recorded Rock Around the Clock in 1954, which reached number 23 before dropping off the charts. A year later, the song was placed over the opening credits to the hit film The Blackboard Jungle, and it shot up to number 1, where it stayed for 8 weeks. For a short while, they were not just the most popular white rock and roll band in the world, they were actually the only one. All right, take a second here, pause, listen to Rock Around the Clock. This is kind of what started all of the rockabilly rock and roll sound, and you can get an idea of what it sounds like. Now, Haley was swept aside by Elvis Presley, who scored his first national hit in March of 1956. Presley was 10 years younger, he was leaner and more attractive than the pudgy and balding Haley, but Haley's country and R&B formula is what many other artists would start to use. Even though Bill Haley was signed to one of the industry majors, which was Decca Records, the record industry thought that rock and roll was just a fad. Independent record labels grabbed control of the market. One of the more aggressive independent labels was Memphis-based Sun Records, owned by Sam Phillips. And something to take note of is if you think about a genre that is more today, say like rap, when it came out in the early 80s, everybody said that it was a fad and that it would go away. And so the same thing happened with rock and roll. And obviously we can see that sometimes the music that we just discard or we think that's not going to make it actually ends up being a big part of our society. Sam Phillips was a true visionary and tremendously influential to the birth of rock and roll. He started his career as a DJ, but the allure of R&B enticed him to start the Memphis Recording Service, and it was strategically located in the northernmost edge of the Mississippi Delta. Phillips' studio was a small room, so he experimented with an innovative tape delay echo to enhance and just fatten up that sound. His first Sun hits included Bearcat by Rufus Thomas and Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog. You might recognize Hound Dog because somebody else covered this, someone like, Elvis Presley. His instincts told him that combining R&B and country music properly would have just this huge crossover appeal. Phillips' Sun recordings would codify what would eventually become known as Rockabilly. Now, Rockabilly is that first style of rock and roll, and it's characterized by merging the two genres of both R&B and country. It also is known for having very fast tempos and a jumping, nervous beat. It limited the instrumentation, so we just have basically an electric and acoustic guitar, an upright bass that's played in a slap fashion to achieve the effect. And later on, they would use drums in both Sun and Rockabilly records. And a single vocalist would use the effect, such as hiccuping and the heavy use of echo. Phillips knew that he needed a distinctive vocal style to achieve success. He once said, "If I could find me a white man who sang with a Negro fill, I could make $1 million." In August of 1953, an 18-year-old truck driver walked in the front door of the Memphis recording studio. Elvis Aaron Presley was born in Mississippi on January 8, 1935. The Presleys were dirt poor, and in 1948, the family moved to Memphis, and Elvis was showing an interest in music, even winning a talent show when he was just 10. So, for his 11th birthday, his parents bought him a guitar. He was also absorbing a variety of influences. This includes country music, from listening to the Grand Ole Opry, gospel music from singing in church, and Memphis black radio stations including R&B. He also hung out at the nightclubs along Beale Street in Memphis, where he heard artists like B.B. King perform live. And there is a picture of a very young Elvis Presley and a very young B.B. King. Although he was painfully shy, by the time he had entered high school, Elvis was greasing his long hair back, wearing brightly colored jackets, pants, and two-toned shoes. In August 1953, Presley recorded 2 songs at the Memphis recording service as a gift for his mother's birthday. Sam Phillips was only mildly impressed, but did hook Elvis up with country musicians, Scotty Moore on guitar, and Bill Black on bass of the Starlight Wranglers, and they began rehearsing. At the trio's first recording session, nothing was going particularly well, and during a break, according to Scotty, all of a sudden Elvis just started singing this song, jumping around and acting the fool. And then Bill picked up the bass, and he started acting the fool too, and I started playing with them. Sam, I think, had the door to the control booth open, and he stuck his head out and said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "We don't know." "Well, back up," he said. "Try to find a place to start and do it again." The song was an R&B tune by author Big Boy Crudup called "That's All Right," but Elvis had reinvented it with an electrifying cross between country western and R&B. The sound was different, yet puzzling. No one was quite sure how to categorize it, but the reaction was instantaneous. 2 nights later, when it was played 7 times in a row on the radio show, the phone lines lit up. Presley was literally an overnight sensation. For many listeners, he was too black sounding, but the effect Presley had on audiences in his live shows defied his off-stage shyness. So what I would like you to do is just stop for a second, pause the video, and I want you to listen to "That's All Right, Mama." So this is the very first one that put Elvis on the map. It hit the radio live for the first time. And you're going to notice a couple things. You're going to hear that hiccuping, you're going to hear that nervous jumping beat. It definitely personifies that rockabilly style, and it is very different from his later music that you'll hear on a later time. Okay, so take a second and listen to this song and listen to how it sounds. You're going to hear both R&B sounds, and you're going to hear that country element to it as well. Then take a second and listen to the original "That's All Right, Mama." Sun Records was nearing bankruptcy and sold Elvis's contract and master tapes to RCA for $35,000, at the time an unheard of amount of money. Colonel Tom Parker became Elvis's new manager and quickly secured more lucrative gigs for Elvis, getting national TV exposure, creating Elvis consumer products, and getting him into Hollywood movies in Las Vegas. Parker took a 50% profit cut and was instrumental in shielding Elvis from the public. He also made the music more accessible to a wider audience by hiring new musicians and a gospel backup chorus. Over time, that raw energy that Sam Phillips had seen at Sun had become slicker and more polished, and Presley started to feel more isolated and alone. Elvis made his first national TV appearance on the Dorsey Brothers stage show in January 1956. After 6 appearances, he moved up to the higher-rated Milton Berle show in June, after which many protested due to the dancing they witnessed. In response, Presley appeared on Steve Allen's show as the new Elvis Presley, dressed in a tuxedo while singing to a dog also dressed in a tux. In September, the Ed Sullivan Show had Presley on after an initial refusal. Elvis's third and final appearance on the program in January 1957 was the famous Above the Waist show, where the producers decided to show only Elvis's upper body because of his suggestive hip movements. Now, what I love about this is we look at today's standards and what we see on TV. Elvis wiggled his hips while he sang, and it was scandalous. Today, think about what is loud on the television and that we see on a regular basis. Presley made his first movie, Love Me Tender, in 1956, and eventually he made a total of 31 films. I have a trailer of the movie for you, and it is kind of interesting to watch, so feel free to pause and click the link to watch that trailer. In March of 1957, he bought Graceland, and on March 24, 1958, Presley entered the Army, where he served in Germany with no special privileges until March of 1960, when he was discharged. While in service, Parker continued to release Presley's recordings. In 1962, he met a 17-year-old model and actress, Priscilla, and they were married in 1967. They had one child, Lisa Marie. Elvis continued to sell throughout the 60s, but his material became more pop-oriented and he fell out of touch with younger rock audiences. Although he staged a comeback with a live TV special in the 70s, Presley was reduced to performing in Las Vegas in these gaudy jumpsuits that cultivated a following of mostly middle-aged female fans. Elvis was becoming more depressed and his use of prescription drugs had increased. The breakup of his marriage to Priscilla in 1972, his weight ballooning, and his drug use all contributed to his death of a heart attack in the second-floor bathroom at Graceland on August 16, 1977. After selling Elvis Presley's contract in late 1955, Sam Phillips was able to quickly turn his finances around. A number of talented young, white Elvis wannabes started showing up at his front door to audition for him. Although he did have success in launching the career of a few country artists such as Johnny Cash and Charlie Rich, most of Phillips' success in the last half of the 50s came from his rockabilly artists. The biggest of these are going to include Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis. Carl Perkins was born to poor sharecropping parents in Northwest Tennessee. He started a band with his brothers playing the honky-tonk circuit in the early 1950s. After hearing Presley's Blue Moon of Kentucky on the radio in 1954, the Perkins brothers auditioned for Phillips, and they released two very country-sounding singles in 1955, and they had modest sales success. But they did a joint concert in 1955 with Johnny Cash, and Johnny Cash suggested that Perkins write a song based on the saying he had often heard while in the service, "Don't step on my blue suede shoes." Recorded and released in December of 1955, Blue Suede Shoes shot up the charts to number 2. In March 1956, the song was near the top of the country and R&B charts, becoming Sun's first million-dollar seller when tragedy struck. Perkins and his brothers were traveling when they were slammed into by a truck. Carl suffered a broken shoulder and a cracked skull, and he was laid up for 6 months. Carl Perkins was unable to come up with another hit, and his career started to flounder. Jerry Lee Lewis was the first bad boy of rock and roll. He was born in Louisiana. Lewis's childhood was also spent in poverty. He was the cousin of a televangelist, and Lewis was thrown out of Bible college his first night after tearing into a boogie-woogie version of My God is Real. By the time he auditioned for Sam Phillips in 1956 at the age of 21, he had been married twice, in jail, and had been turned down by every label he had auditioned for in Nashville. But Phillips took a chance on Lewis, and in February of 1957, Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On was released, which shot up the charts to number 3. And it was followed up with Great Balls of Fire, which went on to number 2 in December. Now, in May of 1958, Lewis arrived in England for a promotional tour with his newlywed third wife. Now, Myra was only 13 years old and was his second cousin. Lewis married her before he was even divorced from his second wife. And as the British press honed in on this scandal, Lewis was taken off tour. After returning to the States, Lewis was blacklisted from the top 40 and canceled from bookings on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. Lewis's career went into a tailspin in less than a year after it had just started. So there is a movie out called Great Balls of Fire about Jerry Lee Lewis's life, and it is a wonderful, fun movie to watch, and you get to hear some really amazing music by Jerry Lee Lewis. If you're interested in movies about the lives of artists, this is definitely one to make sure you watch. Now, it's been out for a long time. I think it came out in the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere around there. But it's a great movie if you can find it and watch it. Take a second, pause. Make sure you're listening to all of these, even if I don't remind you to pause and listen to these songs. Great Balls of Fire, listen to that for a few minutes, and then come back for the next artist. Unlike many of the early rock and roll pioneers, Buddy Holly grew up in a stable, middle-class home in Texas. He had a musical family, and he learned to play several instruments, even winning a singing contest at the age of 5. Much of his early influences came from listening to R&B and country music on the radio. As a teen, he played in a country band, and in 1955, he opened for both Elvis and Bill Haley. Holly began to cultivate rockabilly influences into his music. In February 1957, Buddy Holly and the Crickets began recording at a friend's studio in New Mexico. He was given unlimited access to the studio and took the opportunity to experiment with the technical side, including multi-tracking. One of the first songs was a revamped version of That'll Be the Day, which shot up to the charts, hitting number 1. By 1958, Buddy Holly and the Crickets were successful and living in New York. In August, he married a girl that he had proposed to on the first date. The Crickets returned to Texas, and Holly was involved in a legal battle about contractual issues which tied up his finances. To raise cash, he reluctantly agreed to join the Winter Dance Party Tour in early 1959. And it was to include several Midwestern stops. On this tour, Holly was featured with Richie Valens and a Texas DJ called the Big Bopper. After their second show in Iowa, the three stars chartered a plane to Minnesota, flying into a winter storm with a pilot who was actually not certified to fly. Unfortunately, the plane crashed at 8 miles north of Clear Lake on February 3, 1959, and it killed everybody on board. Please take a second to pause right here and listen to Peggy Sue as our example of Buddy Holly. Don Everly and Phil Everly were born in Kentucky in the late 1930s to the country western stars Ike and Margaret Everly. The family toured together while the brothers were children and learned to sing in a traditional Appalachian style. In 1957, Don and Phil signed with a small independent, Cadence Records. Recording in Nashville, the Everly's slick studio production was achieved with a distinctive sound of acoustic guitars and high vocal harmonies, which influenced the Four Seasons and the Beach Boys, as well as the 60s folk rock groups like the Byrds. After struggling with drug addiction for several years, the brothers broke up in 1973 after a bitter onstage argument, but they then reunited in 1983. Please take a minute, pause here, and listen to Wake Up Little Susie. Even though rock and roll created a musical and cultural revolution, the initial shockwave did not last long. A variety of forces came into play in the late 50s and early 60s that brought sweeping changes to the music. All right, guys, we're at the end of our lecture for Module 3. Please make sure that you complete your lecture notes and come prepared for discussions during class time.